Just a couple of announcements before Alastair gives today's lecture. One is that can also ask me to draw your attention to this slide. So this Sunday, 6th of April, there is a tree planting that he's helped organise, and I'll be leaving from just outside here in the car park at 8:40 on Sunday. If you're interested in participating in that, there's a sign-up sheet in the forestry front office. And the other messages relate to the field trip, so hopefully everybody now has paid and selected the trip that you're going on. Please make sure you read this page so you're aware of what to do. So you just click on field trip on your webpage, all the details are there. There's a bit of preliminary reading. In the tutorial next week we'll do some more work to prepare you for coming on the trip. So make sure you come to that tutorial next week. One exercise is to draw a map of the area based on historic photos and maps. And once you're in the field, you're going to use that map to locate yourself at any given time, and also to draw an annotated map, which will be part of your assessment for your field trip. If anyone has any problems or questions about the field trip, please come and see me and contact me. We're also looking for a couple of volunteer drivers. There'll be a small financial incentive for those who do it. And to get an annual driving licence, come and see me after the lecture and I'll explain what you need to do. You need to do a short test with peers to prove that you can drive a 10-12 seat bus. And once we're at that location, we're doing 3 different walks, and 2 of them, to make it easier for you, we drive in one way back from Alastair's long walk along the beachfront, and we're driving both ways to and from the archaeological sites.
Anyone has to grab a key?
You can't be on keys, you've got to have a full licence. Yeah. If you have a full licence, come and see me.
Alright, what I want to do today is, in many ways I want to sort of give an overview of what we've been looking at so far in the course, and I want to do this by asking a couple of questions. And I want to ask this question about why do people see landscapes in different ways? And I think by asking that question we can look back at all of the panel discussions and lectures that you've been sort of looking at so far, both in terms of the contemporary ecological issues as well as the issues of Australian colonisation. And so what I want to do today is I want to take 2 sort of historical snapshots that sort of might help us understand this question. Why do people see landscapes in different ways? And the first one I want to sort of talk about is the end of the 19th century, going back to my historical talk at the very beginning of the course. And then we'll look at more contemporary ecological controversies that we're going through at the moment. And hopefully this will help you with your essay as well. So if we just go back to what Andrew Campbell was saying and what Richard was saying and what I have been saying, a lot has been said so far that has been rather critical of the way the colonisers have treated the Australian landscape as a resource over the past 200 years. That's mainly what Andrew was talking about, and it's mainly what I was talking about as well. But what I want to suggest here in the first half of my talk is that even if in that process of possessing the land, these European settlers were engaged in practices that these days we would recognise as being unsustainable, we've also got to recognise, though, that they were also doing something positive. in terms of the relationship between societies and landscape. What they were doing was they were creating new myths, or at least new myths were attached to the work of the colonizers as they were working in and working on the landscape. Especially through the work that the pioneers and colonists did in the bush, these European colonizers were offering themselves, and others that followed them, a means by which European Australians could connect with the land and imagine their national origins, and of understanding what was unique about the Australian character. And that's what I want to focus on in the first way, the way that the colonial approach to the landscape and work on the landscape helped forge a myth of a national character. This is often called in Australian history the bush myth, which is said to explain the origins of the Australian identity, and in particular the idea that Australians are an egalitarian race compared to other European countries. And what the basis of this argument is that by taming the landscape with their axe and their plough and fire, the colonists were not only projecting their own European images onto the landscape, they were also transforming their views of who they were themselves, of creating a unique Australian identity. And the origins of this type of historical idea were that under 19th century colonial conditions, there developed what some historians have called a pioneering spirit, a frontier spirit, which involved exploring the land, and then, as Andrew Campbell showed you, of felling and clearing the land, and digging it for wealth and gold, and tending cattle and sheep on that land. And the idea of the bush myth was the idea that the Australian character was forged in this harsh landscape. So you can see how culture and landscape, whether or not we're talking about Aboriginal Australia or a sort of contemporary Australia, is always sort of forged in a relationship. And one of the most influential historians on this idea of the origins of the Australian character was the historian Russell Ward, who argued that a certain ethos of equality developed amongst the early settlers and amongst the rural workers on this harsh and hostile pastoral frontier. This was the origins of what he called the bush legend, or the bush myth. And according to Ward, the conditions under which Australian colonisers settled the land, especially the bush, encouraged an ethos of equality, especially equality amongst men. And just working on this harsh landscape had a levelling effect upon social interaction. And so Ward argued that this formed the basis of contemporary Australian attitudes, whereby the average Australian believes that Jack isn't only as good as his master, but probably even better than his master. Australians were a people that knocked eminent people. And Ward was saying that this came from working in egalitarian conditions in the harsh bush frontier. It was the reason why he said that Australians like to see themselves as being fiercely independent, people who hate officiousness, and people who dislike authority. Yes?
Is it like Australia is sort of like, it's hard to say, like politically slowly trying to be independent. First it was like always going after England, and now it's like going after the US, like pretty much just like dragging behind them. So you can't really say that like politically independent.
There is a big difference between what we do and what we like to think of ourselves as. This is what the bush myth is all about. This is what mythology is all about. It's not actually, as you say, we can actually find many examples of where Australia has sort of doffed its hat at its sort of old colonial masters, and at the United States as well. We've followed the United States, you're right, but Australians still like to see themselves as part of their identity as being fiercely independent, even though we might actually sort of, as you say, we can find sort of good evidence to